our topic tonight will be quite as timely as it was going to be. If anyone here is on Twitter, if anything happens tonight, just give it a shout out. I mean, we're all cut off from the world, but just like if there are any arrests or anything, we all want to know. I want to thank Howard also for his comments about my work. I do have to stand defensively on one point. I did write a novel, and it has sometimes been accused of some implausibility. In fact, when my wife read it, she found some of the dialogue a little over the top. And I said, show me the passages you think are excessive. And so she indicated 4 or 5 passages of dialogue that she thought were excessive. Every one of them was a verbatim Fox News transcript. Verbatim. What has happened tonight? Is an indication that the crisis of law and the Trump administration is coming to a head much sooner, and it is so exciting to be with a room full of lawyers, because it's often hard to get people to understand that it's the processes of our society that are the difference between civilization and barbarity, and that those of you who stand for these processes, I think you deserve the famous toast that John Maynard Keynes gave to the economists. I think it even more applies to the lawyers, where Keynes said of the economists, they're the people who provide not civilization, but the possibility of civilization. And so with law, we uphold the possibility of a way of resolving our differences other than by force and by appeals to supernatural authority. I want to talk a little bit about what has happened in the past few hours in the United States, and then more generally about some of the big questions about rule of law that are not America-specific, but that apply to all of the developed societies. What the Americans are about to test is this proposition. Is enough of the American society, and is enough particularly of the American party structure, committed to the rules of the game as they always have been, or faced with a new kind of challenge? Are they about to discover that their loyalties to this accidental president, because Donald Trump got into office very much on a lucky bounce, deep into the party, deep into the nominating system, it was 2/3 of Republicans said they wished for another candidate than Donald Trump. He was able to, by seizing certain issues, he was able to leverage himself into the Republican nomination, and then by a series of freakish events in the Electoral College, become president despite losing the popular vote by 3 million people, and despite winning even his crucial states by just a handful of votes. One of the things that Canadians are often, your representatives in Washington often point out, is the number of jobs in Pennsylvania that directly depend on trade with Canada is 3 times greater than Donald Trump's margin in the state of Pennsylvania, which says something both about the importance of Canadian trade, but also the thinness of his margin even in the state of Pennsylvania. What has been happening as the situation has come to a head is that the people around Donald Trump have tried to mobilize Republicans in Congress and Republicans in the country to believe that the defense of Donald Trump requires them to believe a series of impossibly untrue things about the law enforcement of the United States. That there is an FBI conspiracy, that there is a deep state that, like in Turkey, that doesn't take orders from its political masters, but that has its own agenda to subvert the political process. None of these things are true, of course. They're outrageously false. And those of you who have had any contact with American criminal law enforcement will know that, look, it's not a problem-free system. It is, compared to other developed societies, the Americans have an unduly politicized law enforcement apparatus, district attorneys and U.S. attorneys, they have political ambitions, state judges are elected. I think from a Canadian point of view, these are, and often from an American point of view, these are disturbing and undesirable elements. But nonetheless, it is a professional apolitical system that is about abstract rules and not about revenge on any one candidate. But in order to defend Donald Trump, people around him have had to wage this kind of intellectual and political warfare against the Department of Justice and the FBI. And the question has been a potential one to now: how far will the Republicans in Congress go down this road? And the question for all of them, because so many of them, the members of Congress do not, most of the members of Congress, and certainly most of the Republicans in the Senate, do not want to go very far down this road, but they are afraid not to, because they're dealing with a party in the country that has been whipped into a frenzy, both by the president and by the most important medium of conservative communications in the United States, that are selling this idea of a conspiracy of law enforcement against the president. The test for the Americans will be which is stronger, party feeling or loyalty to institutions. And I think we are all reasonably optimistic about the outcome, but we should not be so certainly confident, because what we have seen in the United States, what we're seeing across the developed world, is an intensification of those party loyalties. Canada here is an outlier. Canada probably has the least aligned or least polarized party system maybe in the developed world. I remember talking to a friend who was working on one of the Ontario provincial campaigns about 10 years ago, and he made the observation that it happened to be the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party had the most loyal voters of any of the three provincial parties. No more than half of them would desert the party on 24 hours notice. But in the United States, that is not how Republicans and Democrats work. These parties have become as aligned, as ideological, as entrenched as at any time since the aftermath of the Civil War. And that is due to something that you see all over the developed world, which is that a political system that, when I was entering into it, was a political system where the parties were defined basically by their relationship to the productive economy. There was a party in the public sector, there was a party in the private sector, there was a party of people who worked for wages, there was a party of people who worked for salaries, management, labor, creditors, debtors. That was how the parties split, with a little overhang of Catholics versus Protestants, or the Civil War in the United States. That just doesn't describe how party systems work anymore. Across the developed world, with Canada again, something of an exception, the party system is defined by on the one side, a party for those whose grandparents belong to the local ethnic majority, and on the other side, a party for those whose grandparents did not belong to the local ethnic majority. And within that, people can have almost any kind of relationship to the productive economy. They can be rich, they can be poor, they can be creditors, they can be debtors. That is not how they define their allegiances. And that way of splitting up a party system proves to be much more enraging, mobilizing, polarizing than the old way. Race trumps class, as the critical theorists tell us, and that has been what has happened. We have a racially divided party system, an ethnically divided party system, and that is true in France, becoming true in Germany, true in England, not yet true in Canada, not yet true in Australia, but overwhelmingly true in the United States. And that is why the parties can call on loyalties that trump the traditional loyalties to the institutions of the country. How strong are those loyalties? How intense will this contest be? We are about to find out. And it is going to be a very dramatic moment. Back of all of this, and this was before tonight going to be the main theme of my talk today, and I'm going to, in order to leave room for an interaction, because this is a room that, as I said, does not look receptive to oratory, it looks receptive to conversation and conviviality. My theme was going to be a comment given by Peter Mandelson about 20 years ago. Peter Mandelson was, of course, an important intellect in New Labour, a friend of Tony Blair's, and he said on taking a job at the European Commission that the age of representative democracy is drawing to an end. And by that he did not mean we're about to have dictatorship. What he meant was that the locus not only of power but of legitimacy was leaving elected legislatures and moving to other places. It was moving to the courts, it was moving to transnational institutions, it was moving to the executive branch. That people in the democracies no longer looked to their legislators to uphold their interests and their rights. And that is something that is overwhelmingly true of the Canadian experience, where there has been a trend toward identification with courts on a head snapping rate. Once this trend begins, you of course begin a cycle, because as power leaves anybody, but as power leaves these legislatures, the legislatures shrink to their prestige shrinks to their new responsibilities. The quality of people they attract, the way they behave, You see this in the American Congress, that Congress no longer thinks its job is to supervise the president. That's a job for the courts and for the FBI, for the Department of Justice. Back in the 1970s, when Jimmy Carter was president, he faced a Democratic Congress for all 4 years that he was president. And yet that Congress was a very effective check on things he wanted to do, including some things where he was right and they were wrong, but they still checked him, just to show who was boss. Because one of the ways of showing that you're boss is to stop somebody from doing something, and anybody can stop somebody from doing something bad, but you're really the boss if you stop somebody from doing something good. Teaches a lesson. This drift is having an effect on, I think this drift is one of the reasons for this poll that I cite in Trumpocracy that has become deservedly very famous. It's the work of German-American political scientist Yascha Mounk, who has written also an important new book. Mounk, if you don't know his work, got a big grant 2 or 3 years ago to do a survey across 12.5 developed countries, including Canada, Sweden, and others. And he asked this question: is it personally essential to you to live in a democratic country? And among those who were born during the 1930s, you would get answers of yes of 80 to 90%. And among those born since 1980, you would get answers of between 25 and 30%, varying from country to country. And it was a perfect step system that with each decade, it became less urgent. Now, obviously, what we were in some way tracking was the memory of the war, the Depression, and the early Cold War. But you were also, I think, picking up something new, because Mounk, he was aware of this bias, he asked a series of other questions like, would it be good to be ruled by one strong person who could set aside the bickering of politicians? And the answer went yes to that, not as steeply as the answer went down no for the essentiality of democracy. A lot of people said democracy is an essential, weren't against it exactly, they just weren't excited by it. But you could see preferences for various kinds of authoritarian rule or skepticism about non-authoritarian rule rising with the generations. What is going on there, it seems to me, is a feeling that these ways of governing do not deliver the goods. That the people who came of age after World War II believed in democratic systems, not just to be free of the midnight knock on the door of concentration camps and secret police, but because this system that had looked so weak and ineffective, even if morally better, looked weak and ineffective before World War II, after World War II looked powerful and successful, and it delivered the goods. And since about the year 2000, for many people in many countries, the system has stopped delivering the goods. And they no longer look to elected politicians to be able to repair that. And so what you're seeing on both the political left and the right is an increasing turn to messianic figures. I often point to the Bernie Sanders movement in the United States. I mean, you have to badly want a Messiah to think that Bernie Sanders is the Messiah. There's a mean joke that goes on in Washington that the reason Ted Cruz needed to be in the U.S. Senate was to save Bernie Sanders from being the most disliked person in the U.S. Senate. But that hunger is there, and Bernie Sanders' promise is in many ways very like Donald Trump's. Donald Trump's famous words were, "I alone can fix it." Bernie Sanders' answer to every question, he said, we're going to cancel all the student debt. How are you going to do that? We're going to have a revolution. He didn't mean like a revolution of blood and violence. He meant something actually, in a way, even more ominous. He meant a revolution in public affairs that would make difficulties magically vanish. That messianic turn, you can see from the Jeremy Corbyn movement in the UK, it is not exclusively a phenomenon of the political right. But it is, as people lose the memory of actual personal participation in things like the PTA and the Lions Club and serving on juries and the intimate kindergartens of civic engagement, they become more and more unaware of what is involved in getting consent from a group of people who are not like you, don't think differently. And as you do that project less yourself, you could become less and less understanding of the difficulty of it, and more incapable of understanding why the people who do it for a living, the politicians, are not only failing, but seeming to fail more and more often. So the problem of the rule of law in the age of Trump is most fundamentally a problem of representative government in the age of Trump, and how you get people to believe in representative government again. And that requires a way to get back onto the virtuous cycle, where as you make it stronger, so you make it more respected. It is it's a common joke attributed to many people that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and hoping for a different result. But what we do is we constantly try to revive our institutions by moving more and more power to where ordinary people not only can't get at it, but can't even imagine influencing it, and where more and more of the important questions of life are deferred to experts who seem not to share values, not to share interests, and who are more and more separated from in every aspect of their lives from the people that they govern. And this has created a mood of alienation that makes many things possible. The fortunate thing for the United States, the story may turn out to have a happy ending in the United States, just because Donald Trump was so sloppy and his misconduct so blatant that he may not in the end be able to mobilize the protection that he's going to need. And he may end up being felled, if this Michael Cohen raid is an indication, by actually the most ordinary and least system-threatening of his behaviors, which is his habit of paying off the women he harassed. And everyone can understand that, and in a way it cuts across. It may be a convenient release for the system because a lot of people who have made excuses for other more fundamentally wrong things may be able to say, well, I'm not implicated in this. This I can turn my back on without feeling that I was betrayed, or without feeling that I was made a fool of, or that I was complicit. I never signed up for this. And the very slovenliness of this operation may give everyone an easy exit ramp. But what is also very possible the United States may be heading to, and this is my nightmare scenario, and therefore the one that, because I'm kind of a pessimistic person, I tend to believe is the most likely, is that we may discover that the real issue here is the Russia issue. And that the outcome of this may be that the Mueller investigation is going to find out that the people around Donald Trump, and maybe Trump himself, did a bunch of things that were illegal and did a bunch of things that were system-threatening. Only the system-threatening things weren't illegal, and the illegal things weren't system-threatening. So we may have a bunch of arrests for money laundering, for failure to declare as foreign agents, for people chiseling on their taxes, for various kinds of wire fraud. And Manafort and the people around him will be in a lot of trouble for that. But they may discover that on the core evil of working with a foreign power in clandestine ways against your domestic political opponents, it is, unless you trip over certain technical violations of the election law, that may turn out not to be illegal. And then we are going to have a real test of the integrity of the society, as the question is whether the things that are not written down, but that are really the things that make a democracy go, whether those things remain enforceable in the face of the tremendous ethnic and partisan and cultural and ideological polarization that characterizes the United States very much, but also almost all of the other developed societies too. Let me pause there and let's have more of an interchange, because I've talked a long time. I feel like, thank you. And I feel like I'm in a room full of people who thought very deeply and hard about these issues, so I'm going to learn a lot from you.
Okay, so we'll have some questions, and we'll ask David to step down, because I know some people in the back are having trouble hearing you.
This is not working. I'm sorry.
Apologies. So if we can just clear a way for people who have questions to come up and ask their questions. And of course, as usual, please let your question be a question. Since we only have one mic, we'll just have David repeat the gist of the question. And
Sure. Let's say I'm a country in Eastern Europe, let's say I'm a country in Eastern Europe or in the Balkans right now, and I'm making a decision about whether. Let's say I'm a country in Eastern Europe right now, or in the Balkans, or somewhere in Southern America. I'm trying to make a decision about whether I should try to align myself with America, with NATO, with the European Union, or continue my own independent path through a populist leader in Hungary, or then just one again. How do I begin to make a decision about whether I can count on America, whether I can count on the leadership succession plan there? Sorry.
From the point of view of Eastern Europe, the Balkans and the Baltics, the most threatened countries in Europe, and not just from their point of view, how do you know whether to trust American leadership? And more broadly, I think behind that question is the path of development that the United States, and not the United States alone, have recommended to all of these countries. And it's a really haunting question. And let me, since the Hungarian election just took place, I don't know if you all follow it, I want to point to one of the reasons why Viktor Orban is so enormously popular. It's a little, and some of you may know the story, it's a little off the beaten track, but if you give me, I think it's worth it if you give me 90 seconds. It's very hard to borrow, there's a very weak mortgage market in all the small countries of southeastern, Central Europe for all kinds of reasons. So there was a practice grew up in the late 2000s of getting mortgages by borrowing your money from Swiss banks in Swiss francs. Borrowing your mortgage money from Swiss banks in Swiss francs. This sounds obviously like an insane thing to do, but at the time it didn't look as crazy as it seemed, because at that time all of these countries were committed to entering the euro, and the Swiss, for reasons of their own, had pledged to keep the Swiss franc fixed against the euro. And all of this worked, so you got very cheap money, and all this worked extremely well until 2010 and the euro crisis, when the Swiss upvalued against the euro, and then suddenly everybody who had borrowed in Swiss francs was facing personal financial disaster. And across a bunch of these countries, there are hasty consultations, the bankers were brought in, and the question was, who should bear the burden of adjustment to this shock? And across most of the countries, they followed the orthodox view. There are basically three groups of people: the homeowners, the bankers, or somebody else. And across most of Europe, the decision was made, this burden will fall on the homeowners. And Viktor Orban, who had just taken power in Hungary, said, not in Hungary. In Hungary, we are going to make the burden fall on the bankers, and especially the foreign-owned banks. And if they don't like it, they can find somebody else to bail them out. And he protected Hungary in a violation of all kinds of banking rules and EU regulations. He protected Hungarian homeowners against this shock. So the reason to tell this story is that we have, in recommending our path, and also over the past 18 years, put a burden of adjustment on ordinary people that they never had to bear in the period from 1945 until about the 21st century. And so that is an example of one of the ways in which elite groups have forfeited confidence by seeming to have interests that are separate from that of most of their population, interests they put first ahead of most of the population.
David, can I take you back to the observations that you were making about the capitulation of the legislative branches in making the rules and supervising the executive, which seems to me to be a bit of a chicken and egg problem in terms of the population losing its confidence in that branch, but that branch losing the spine to do its role. And that capitulation seems to be taking place in an environment where the welfare state basically needs the discretion of the executive to carry out what it wants to do, and so the idea of fixed rules and legislation has become sort of passé, sort of a thing you can't have in a system where the discretion of the executive determines what the administrative state wants to do. So can you address that chicken and egg problem? Which comes first, and why doesn't the legislative branch, it has the power to make rules, why doesn't it just take it back and legislate away?
So hopefully your answer will be, just what will get me a good mark. As you've said before, Congress has been...
Your prop is in the back row, though. So
as you said, Congress has been more than willing to cede power to the executive to kind of insulate itself from, public opinion and things like that. What do you think are ways in which, in the American system, Congress can go about, getting back trust from people, more willing to take on the responsibility of checking the executive and checking Trump, even if he eventually, doesn't win again? But how do you think they can proactively go about doing that?
how can Congress, it's very much in the American context, take back some of the power it's lost to the executive? First, they have to make up their mind they want it. And that they want it all the time, not some of the time. Because the last area where Congress really got serious with this was the war-making power after Vietnam. And they passed the War Powers Act, and the War Powers Act was designed to make sure that a president could not do Korea and Vietnam again, and there would have to be, if not a formal declaration of war, some kind of authorization of military force, and Congress would have hearings, and that was the idea. The War Powers Act set a series of timetables of 30, 60, 90 days in which the president could act. But of course, Congress would have to enforce that, and what happens is there are then crises. Something happens, something heart-rending, and something televised, and everyone says, do something about this. Do it now. And we want the executive to act. And, well, okay, that doesn't violate the War Powers Act, because the War Powers Act, the president has pretty wide discretion for the first 30 days and reasonably wide for 90 days. But the problem is the decisions you make in the first 30 days are often compel what happens next. And then you find yourself in a situation of conflict. And Congress has not wanted to take, that would be the first step, to make a decision, we really want this power back. And that would require making the committees of Congress work again. And this is the way that Congress is very different from parliaments, that no parliamentary system really works through committees. They work through the party system. The Congress works through this committee system, and that committee system would have to be rebuilt, and that means moving power back again from the party leaders in both houses to the chairs of the committees. The big negative on that, the reason why that hasn't happened, is when you take the committee seriously, what you discover is that regional interests matter more than party interests do. On the Agriculture Committee, the peanut people may think differently from the cotton people, but they have enough in common that they can work together irrespective of party lines. If you want to make a strong party system in Congress, and as your party system becomes more ideological, you will see those regional interests as detrimental, and that the party and you will then find the parties find themselves attacking most ferociously. Republicans attack most ferociously the remaining Democrats in rural areas, and Democrats attack most ferociously the Republicans in urban areas. And pretty soon, that those inevitable regional alliances are utterly subsumed into the party system, and the party system then finds itself, and this is the big change that's happened since the 1970s, putting the interests of a president of the same party ahead of the institutional interests of the Congress, regardless of party.
David, given everything we saw today and the other issues that this president has on his plate, does he make it through this term?
Does Trump make it through this term? I would say, barring a health event, yes. Now, the health event is, by the way, an important caveat, because we're used to presidents living a very long time. The last president not to make it to 90 was Lyndon Johnson. So we just expect that presidents will make it to 90. But that's not, there are always exceptions, and Donald Trump would be a candidate for a negative health event. I wish him long life. But he's not a profile in healthiness, and that may actually someday be a way out for him. But what is the mechanism? Because his party is bound to him. And an impeachment process can't even start until the Democrats get at least one House. And it's very hard to imagine an impeachment process successfully rolling forward unless you had public opinion move in ways that public opinion has not moved. And it's also, the Democrats are going to have some cynical interest. They're going to want him there in 2020. They think they can beat him, and they also have, and this is a really dark thing about them, they have an extremely bitter divide within that party. The Bernie Sanders-Hillary Clinton debate is not going away. It's incredible. I mean, the most bitter battle on the Republican side of my lifetime was Ford versus Reagan in 1976. And after it was over, it was over. And indeed, then Reagan made a real effort to get Ford to be his running mate in 1980. And and when that failed, he hired Ford's entire team, and his administration ended up being, and his White House ended up being staffed with Ford loyalists, not Reagan loyalists. He did a merger. That has not happened. That never happened between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders because the divide reflected really powerful things in the society. The competition to be the most implacable opponent of Donald Trump and to get the 2020 nomination is going to make it very difficult for the Democratic Party to work effectively in Congress.
So let me ask you the converse. So you can't go after Trump, then you go after Google, Facebook, and Amazon. Is that what you see the
Well, that's what the president is. The president is going after Amazon ferociously.
But I can't do much damage. I think the other guys can.
I think we have a lot of investigations of Facebook. Do not underestimate the corruption of the American political system. That Facebook had, that all of these tech companies had underinvested in lobbying. Facebook has done this huge ramp up of its Washington presence. And if Facebook really applies itself, it can buy a lot of protection. And I think that's going to be their strategy. And it's hard for me to imagine this or any future Congress doing the kinds of things that have happened even within the European Union. Because one of the things I think, I don't know a lot about this, but my perception is the Facebook business model is not incredibly lucrative, but also incredibly fragile. That if anyone ever said to them, you're responsible. If somebody defames somebody else on their Facebook page, you're responsible. You have the responsibilities of a publisher. I mean, at that point, they have to hire 100,000 editors, and suddenly they go from being, the most profitable company in the world to being like your local newspaper, barely making a living. Yeah.
I'm curious what you'd like to see happen in 2020, I guess on both parties, and how realistic is what you'd like to have happen actually to happen?
Yeah. What would I like to see happen in 2020? I have a very divided consciousness about this because there are different things that different parts of me would like to see happen. Do you remember the joke from the last days of communism? About that there were two solutions to the problems of Poland, the miraculous and the practical. One of the solutions was that communism would reform itself. That was the miraculous solution. And the other was that the Virgin of Cheskawa, with all of her ministering angels, would descend and solve all of Poland's problems. That was the practical. So I'm a little divided have that way. I mean, obviously what I would like is a mass act of conscientious reflection of the Republican Party, an independent a primary challenge to Donald Trump by a Mitt Romney-like figure. Donald Trump is decisively repudiated by his own party, and then Mitt Romney, the Mitt Romney figure, rides on a premise of rejuvenating NATO and restoring integrity in government and balancing the budget with consumption tax. I mean, that's what I would like. So that's the communism reforming itself solution. I think failing that. Republicans are going to need what Monty Python used to call hitting in the head lessons. And they're going to need some pain because, and they're going to need enough pain that no one can say that it was because of the biased media or something like that Donald Trump won, where they are going to really have to face, we bought into this fraud. We didn't want to, by the way, but we did. And we signed up for it just at exactly the moment when we should have understood how terrible it was. And we have to really rethink as an institution, how did we get suckered in this way? That's a very, that's going to take some pain and maybe some generational transition.
What about the Democrats?
Again, what I would like to happen is not very like, what I would like to happen is that they find some dull moderate, who would run on a no sudden moves, reinvigorate NATO ticket. What I think is really going to happen is they're going to do Bernie versus Hillary Part 2 and tear themselves to pieces over who is more radical than that. And the question, and there's going to be a huge argument: what does it mean to be radical? Is the test of radicalism because they have both an economic and a cultural radicalism. And the two are very seldom expressed by the same politicians. So you have a lot of politicians like the Kamala Harrises who express cultural radicalism, but economic non-radicalism. And then you have the Bernie Sanderses who express economic radicalism, but who have been very slow to the cultural radicalism. And so then what happens is the Bernie Sanders electorate becomes almost as white and male, if somewhat younger, than the Donald Trump electorate. And the Kamala Harris, if it is she or somebody like her electorate, becomes both African American plus rich people. And which is that was the Hillary Clinton coalition, and it's a very unstable and not sufficient coalition. And it's hard to see how those two groups work well together. Yes, sir.
Thanks for joining us tonight, David. Big issue here in Canada is, with the current administration, is the renegotiation of NAFTA. Be curious. Thanks for joining us tonight, David. Big issue here in Canada is, with the current administration, is the renegotiation of NAFTA. Be curious to know your view on how committed you think the president might be to disrupting or withdrawing from NAFTA, particularly given where the electoral fallout from such a decision might lie, particularly with the red states and the agricultural states that are highly reliant on that relationship. Thanks.
I think we have really in the past 2 or 3 weeks, we've really gotten an answer to that question, which is Trump derives both more psychic and political juice from trade conflicts with China than he, by the way, I cannot prove this. I have no reason to know it. I am morally convinced that Donald Trump only learned after Inauguration Day that Canada was in NAFTA. I don't think he knew that. And what he discovered then when he began going after NAFTA was that he was running into very important constituencies, including a lot of Republican governors who got very upset. I mean, in Texas, I talked about Pennsylvania. I think the figure is in Texas there are 1 million jobs that depend directly on trade with Mexico. You can't, and the Texas fundraising machine is absolutely indispensable to the success of the Republican Party. So I think NAFTA became too difficult and too scary. And meanwhile, he found out, anyway, that wasn't what got his people excited. They didn't want a trade war. They wanted a wall on the Mexican border, symbolic of their ethnic disdain, but they didn't actually want to impede the U.S.-Mexico economic relationship. Whereas the China map, that is really exciting, and it's exciting to him. It's what he cares about. So I think we're going to see more and more of that. Now, it's very scary from the point of view of the world economy. You see how suddenly volatile the financial markets have got. And I don't know how far he will ever go in closing the deal. I mean, one of the things he's learned is that you can get a lot of political impact by setting things in motion and then forgetting about them for a long time. And actually, the advantage of it, then you can do them again, and set them in motion again, and get the second political bump, and then forget about them for a time.
On how committed you think the president might be to disrupting or withdrawing from NAFTA, particularly given where the electoral fallout from such a decision might lie, particularly with the red states and the agricultural states that are highly reliant on that relationship. Thanks.
I think we have really in the past 2 or 3 weeks, we've really gotten an answer to that question, which is Trump derives both more psychic and political juice from trade conflicts with China than he, by the way, I cannot prove this. I have no reason to know it. I am morally convinced that Donald Trump only learned after Inauguration Day that Canada was in NAFTA. I don't think he knew that. And what he discovered then when he began going after NAFTA was that he was running into very important constituencies, including a lot of Republican governors who got very upset. I mean, in Texas, I talked about Pennsylvania. I think the figure is in Texas there are 1 million jobs that depend directly on trade with Mexico. You can't, and the Texas fundraising machine is absolutely indispensable to the success of the Republican Party. So I think NAFTA became too difficult and too scary. And meanwhile, he found out, anyway, that wasn't what got his people excited. They didn't want a trade war. They wanted a wall on the Mexican border, symbolic of their ethnic disdain, but they didn't actually want to impede the U.S.-Mexico economic relationship. Whereas the China map, that is really exciting, and it's exciting to him. It's what he cares about. So I think we're going to see more and more of that. Now, it's very scary from the point of view of the world economy. You see how suddenly volatile the financial markets have got. And I don't know how far he will ever go in closing the deal. I mean, one of the things he's learned is that you can get a lot of political impact by setting things in motion and then forgetting about them for a long time. And actually, the advantage of it, then you can do them again, and set them in motion again, and get the second political bump, and then forget about them for a time.
Last question.
I want to thank you also for being here today for two reasons. So it's also the first time in a long time I've been in the presence of so many lawyers since my divorce. That said, I want to ask you about an op-ed in The Guardian today that suggested that the U.S.'s adventures in Syria will never, ever succeed on the brink of Trump's soon-to-be-made decision about further bombing in Syria. And because of your background and wisdom, I wonder if you could comment on whether there is indeed a solution to that problem.
I won't pretend to have any special insight into whether there's a solution to the Syria problem. The thing that the United States has always bumped up against, that President Obama bumped up against when he started looking at it, was if you want to stabilize a civil war, you can't just punish the bad actors. You have to have someone that you're for, that what the country needs is a government, and someone has to be in it. And who would that be? And because the United States and its friends have never either found or been interested in building or been able to build, I don't want to suggest they didn't work hard on this, a government they never found anyone they supported enough to invest the money and blood and treasure, the money and treasure it would have taken, the money and blood it would have taken to install that government in place of whatever is there now. But I think it's very clear that what Donald Trump wants are spectacular demonstrations from time to time, but with no sustained commitment. And he demonstrated, it's almost exactly a year ago that he fired those 60 cruise missiles without having any follow-up plan at all. I imagine something like that is going, maybe on a somewhat bigger scale, is going to happen again. But I would say, talking about something I do think harder about and feel more confident in my opinion about the future of Syria. I mean, I'm someone who normally favors a more forward American presence in the world. But if I were told that the United States is planning a naval expedition, but that because of lack of maintenance funds, that none of its aircraft carriers were deployable, I was, well, then don't do it. Or there'd been a mutiny in the army and the loyalty of the soldiers was unreliable. You'd say, well, don't do it. I mean, don't act until you can act with success and until your Navy or your Army. Now, both of these things are unimaginable situations. But when you have a commander-in-chief who cannot be a good and effective and trustworthy commander-in-chief, that's as big a problem as undeployable aircraft carriers and disloyal soldiers. So I would say, for the time being, it would be reckless for the United States to go in any kind of international confrontation because it just can't function. And one of the reasons I find the appointment of John Bolton so concerning is not because I think he's such a super hawk. I don't think he's so much more hawkish than the people Hillary Clinton would have appointed, frankly, who are pretty hawkish. And I don't think he is I mean, he's a little ruder to friends and allies than a normal national security advisor would be, but I'm sure his manners will improve under the pressure of the job. The problem is that the National Security Council, it's the central brain of the United States government. It has to work as an intelligence gathering, intelligence sharing operation. And it requires very special skills to be a good national security advisor. And they don't overlap even 1% with the skills for being an effective personality on Fox News. And so that project of making sure, let's make sure that from all of these vast national security bureaucracies, the information flows effectively into the much smaller circle of the National Security Council, that it's debated, that contrary views are heard. I mean, this is one of the things that happened in the run-up to Iraq. That, and I remember this very vividly, that you create scenarios, best case, worst case, middle case, worst case. And what government ends up doing is gravitating to the middle case, unless they badly, badly want to do something, and then they choose the best case. And then the Bush case, they then up that by 15%. But sometimes it's the worst case, and sometimes there is a worser case even than the worst case. And you need people around the table who can speak to that. And you need mechanisms for making sure that that gets really taken. That you all say, what if it's the worst case? Do we still think this is worth doing? And that takes organizational abilities that obviously Donald Trump doesn't have, and that he's now picked both a Secretary of State who's got many abilities. Mike Pompeo has many skills. He's an impressive person, but this is not his excellence. And in John Bolton, he's got a national security advisor in a job where this ability is even more important, who can't do it at all, cannot deal with people who disagree with him. And dealing with these people who disagree with you is the most important thing you do as a national security advisor, because the president has to hear from all of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for your remarks.